As a young doctoral student of economics, I was always drawn to think about the conceptual foundations of our field and of social science in general. I had two heroes, and they're sitting there. It was Jon Elster and Thomas Schelling. The Strategy of Conflict remains my all-time favorite academic book. I wanted to bring my copy of Jon's book, Sour Grapes, but it's so yellow and so full of blue ink that I thought it wouldn't really be decent. It is absolutely filled with notes. At the time when I first read it, that is 25 years ago, I approved of most of what you wrote. No, that's the wrong word. I loved what you wrote. And I learned a few useful lessons in rational behavior, too. For example, in that book, you emphasize that there are situations in which trying to achieve your goals can be self-defeating. Try too hard to be popular, and you become unpopular. Try too hard to sleep, and you will stay awake. I still practice those lessons. So, Jon, you are, intellectually speaking, an old friend. But today, I'll be aspiring to Nietzsche's dictum: the man of knowledge must be able not only to love his enemies, but also to hate his friends. Or, as you said, meet them in the corridor and say, what you've done is bullshit. In fact, I guess today's treason is as close as I'll ever get to being Daniel Ellsberg. But before doing so, let me emphasize a few points that we do agree on. Number one, too much talent is attracted to the world of finance. You didn't say so, but I would like to add a corollary to that. Too few talented people are attracted to become school teachers. Whether there are too many professors of finance and whether they are too well paid is another issue that I shall have no public opinion on. Number two, we agree that social sciences need to be more scientific. Yes, I'm afraid that much of social science is riddled with false positives. That is, many so-called findings are just random draws that happen to come out in a surprising or clean way, whereas other mundane findings fill up drawers of scientists and get rejected by the journals. Although I consider myself a behavioral economist, I don't think that we are doing better than others on this score. Quite possibly, we're doing worse. The only comfort is that the issue is on the table today like never before. In a forthcoming article in American Economic Review, the authors, Jon Elster and co-authors, they both quantify the likely magnitude of this problem, and they propose a radical tightening of the criteria for acceptable experimental research. Number three, scrutinize the fables. Social scientists are indeed far too willing to believe stylized facts, or even worse, fables based on a single inaccurately told story. In fact, it's ironic that you bring up the Kitty Genovese case. Of course, I agree with you that it's dubious to interpret the passive bystanders as playing a mixed strategy equilibrium. Basically, I don't think we should expect people to play an equilibrium in new situations they haven't been in before. However, Dixit and Skeet's game theoretic speculation builds on a much worse scientific error. There just weren't a lot of bystanders, certainly not 38, maybe 2 or 3, to the killing of Kitty Genovese in 1964. A crucial chapter in many textbooks of social psychology is therefore based mostly on fiction. It took more than 50 years before 3 social psychologists investigated the police files to discover the actual sequence of events. Number 4, the rationality of beliefs. Yes, game theorists have been far too willing to assume rational beliefs. That is, to make the assumption not only that people are rational, that they take actions that are consistent with their goals, but that rationality is common knowledge and that players have common priors. But then again, we are working hard to improve. Many have tried to study heterogeneous priors, including Darren Acemoglu, whom you criticize, Jürgen Weibel, who is here, and perhaps especially that great macroeconomist, the hardest of the hard, Thomas Sargent. But that's the end, I'm afraid, of our agreement. Before turning to my substantive objections at your talk, let me mention that you use the word rational behavior more narrowly than most economists do, and this leads to unnecessary confusion. Gary Becker's definition, which the serious parts of the profession have largely adopted, allows people to care about others as well as to take pleasure in revenge. There is nothing irrational about that. Okay, so I count that as an agreement then. So then I misinterpreted one of your slides. Thanks. That's wonderful. Then we have five agreements. Yeah, because then we agree that economics is not a particular theory about tastes, and certainly not the theory that rests on the presumption that all people are selfish materialists. Well, another nitpick is that when you talk about economic science today, I sometimes get the feeling of being placed in a time machine and transported several decades back into the past. We know that's impossible, by the way. Decades into the future, we could, in theory, travel. But if you want to direct criticism at the current state of the art in economics, I think I would rather recommend the work of recent Clark medalists such as Esther Duflo and Amy Finkelstein. I recommend all of you to go to their homepages and you'll get an impression of what research economists today find particularly admirable. Now, to the bigger issues where we disagree. Here are 2 statements, one from your article and one from today's talk. The first statement is, rational choice models may be of interest on 3 distinct grounds. First, they may help us to explain, predict, or shape behavior. And then you say, although simple and robust models may do this in a rough and ready sense, the sophisticated models that are the pride of the profession do not. And today, in the notes you state, the theory is limited, however, to determining short-term effects of small changes in, say, the tax rate. Now, what exactly does this mean? Certainly, you cannot mean that all rational choice theory on purely logical ground is limited to predicting short-term effects of small changes. I mean, that would be a sensational theorem. And after all, generations of economists have been telling their students that the major justification for preferring structural economic models over reduced form statistical relationships is that the structural model offer predictions concerning long-run effects of large changes, whereas reduced form models do not. So therefore, I take it that what you mean to be making is an empirical statement that attempts to predict the long-run effect of large changes usually fail. But empirical statements require evidence, and it's frustrating that you provide so little. So to focus the debate, let me tell a rational choice theory success story. You may recognize it. High school admissions procedures have a long history of inefficiency all over the world. But 10 years ago, after a particularly unsuccessful year, with more than 30% of students being allocated to schools that hadn't even been on the ranking lists, a smart bureaucrat in New York got the idea to contact economist Alvin Roth to see if he could come up with a better system. Roth is one of the world's greatest practitioners of rational choice theory. And he had previously redesigned the system for matching doctors with hospitals in the United States. Within months, Roth and his co-authors had constructed a vastly improved system. And as his theory predicted, under the new algorithm, students stopped trying to game the system. They preferred instead to reveal their preferences truthfully, and the fraction of students allocated to a school outside their list dropped sharply. These effects have been lasting, and similar systems are being put in place all over the world now. So what is a lesson? Well, it's plain and simple. Sometimes sophisticated rational choice theory, the pride of the profession, allows you to predict quite accurately the impact of large changes, both in the short run and in the long run. It even allows you to think about which large changes would be most desirable and to shape people's behavior accordingly. Now, of course, you might now object that school choice is an unusually simple and well-defined task. Yes, indeed, but it was you who brought up the point that to be a specialist in something, you need 10,000 hours of practice. I mean, I'm very inept at a lot of things, but buying milk and other mundane activities I can do with far less practice, and we study those activities too. Okay. But you might still object that, okay, this is a very well-defined task. It's just within the reach of the hard obscurantists. It is when we economists start having opinions about big issues, complex issues, such as, let's say, financial market regulation. That's when we go wrong, no? Okay, again, I totally disagree. Bad regulation was probably a major cause of the financial crisis, but bad regulation was the offspring of a poisonous relationship between a special branch of misguided right-wing ideology and very powerful vested interests. It had nothing at all to do with financial economics. Indeed, if there is anything that financial economists agree on, from Joe Stiglitz to Gene Farmer, it is that banks should not be allowed to gamble wildly with taxpayers' money. And this is not mere post-hockery. Okay? It's a self-evident consequence of any rational choice theory that the timing of a collapse in asset pricing, it can never be accurately predicted, but still it's possible to see that lax regulation and the growth in shadow banking did pose a threat to the stability of the system. One of the world's leading experts on financial intermediation, Raghu Rajan, wrote extensively about that threat and the need for better regulation in 2005. But the establishment at Jackson Hole didn't want to listen. So, in this domain too, structural models can be used for thinking through the effects of large-scale changes. Jon is saying that we should give up on such scientifically informed ambitions, so ambitious social engineering. I say, listen to the rational choice theorists. Read the books on financial regulation by Anat Admati and Martin Helvig, and by Matthias de Vatripon, Jean-Charles Rocher, and Jean Tirole. And ask your politicians why they don't listen to them. Okay, finally, long-term capital management. You brought it up, so I have to pick up the ball. Here are two celebrated financial economists, Merton and Scholes, involved in a huge gamble which threatens the world's financial system. In the process, they're applying mathematical analysis of option pricing, which is partly responsible, we all agree, for the vast growth of derivatives markets on which their gamble is based. Surely that must be proof that something is rotten in the field of economics. No, it's not proof. Let me take it in steps. First, I think we all agree that Nazism in the 1930s is not evidence that something was rotten in the world of amateur painting. I also think that now that feelings have cooled down, most of us would agree that Knut Hamsun's political stance does not diminish the value of his literature. At the time, my great-grandfather, who was imprisoned by the Nazis, he disagreed and came very close to burning the books that he had so cherished. Perhaps we start having some disagreement over Albert Einstein and John von Neumann. After all, we wouldn't have had Hiroshima and Nagasaki without the field of nuclear physics. And to boot, John von Neumann was a crucial member of the Manhattan Project. But even in this case, the disagreement does not concern the scientific credentials of von Neumann's contributions. His physics, I think we both agree, was impeccable. The sensible disagreement we might have concerns his ethics. And so it is with Merton and Scholes. Their mathematical theorems have not been disproven. Furthermore, they and we always knew that their theory of options prices would at best be a good approximation and never predict prices perfectly. Their simplifying assumptions would never be exactly fulfilled in practice. But compared to other theories, including just about all the theories in social science and probably most theories in medicine, it still predicts remarkably well. Actually also on data that predates the development of the theory. So the fate of long-term capital management was ultimately down to inappropriate financial regulation in combination with the human trait that economics is regularly chided for exaggerating, greed. Overconfidence may have played a role too. But that's beside the point. Because whatever you think about the character of Myron Scholes, the fate of long-term capital management says nothing about the theoretical validity or the empirical relevance of the Black-Scholes formula. So of course, these days it's more socially acceptable to blame economic crisis on a profession than on an ethnic group or on a religious community. But my hypothesis is that historians will view them the same. The argument that the academic economists did it flows from emotions, more precisely from the all too human need for a scapegoat, rather than from careful thinking, now as well as then. And if this defense of economic science has also been too emotional and not analytical enough, I beg Jon's, the audiences, and my fellow economists' forgiveness.